It is time to begin our Bible class. Is in Daniel chapter 6, very, very familiar chapter. We're working our way through the book of Daniel, and we have come to the most well-known story account probably in the whole book, perhaps in the whole Bible. There are handouts on the chair in the back. Earl Clay's got them. If you'd like a handout to kind of follow along and fill in the blanks. You don't have to do that, but you may if you wish. There won't be a grade we won't take them up and grade them at the end or anything. We have a few announcements that we will have before our class begins. Congratulations to Tyler and Lauren Tipton Horton to announce the arrival of Henrietta Grace Horton on July 13th. She weighed 7 pounds and 1 ounce and is 19 and a half inches long. Proud grandparents are Mike and April Tipton, and great-grandparents Vernon and Catherine. We know all those folks, and it is good to have them. I always think it's funny that they tell you how much they weigh and how long they are, and I always wanted to do that when I baptized somebody, when they were reborn, when they were born again and stand up. I'd always like to say, this is our new brother. He's 6 feet tall and he weighs 250 pounds. And but never actually had the nerve to do it, but may try it one of these days. Our heartfelt sympathy is expressed to the family of our dear sister, Faye Donaldson. Faye fought the fight for a long time. Sweet, wonderful Christian lady, went home to be with the Lord this past week, and her funeral is this coming Wednesday at 1. The visitation is from 11 to 1. Funeral at 1 at Tall Funeral Home. We will provide a funeral meal in the fellowship hall. Sign up on the bulletin board to bring food. Also, Faye has requested, or it has been requested, that donations to the Malindi Africa Fund are suggested in lieu of flowers. Rather than flowers for Faye, give to the Malindi Africa Fund. Mike Amberg had outpatient surgery Tuesday for kidney stones, but I don't think you'd call it outpatient because he's in the hospital. They put him, he's inpatient. He spent the night at Baptist in Lexington. I think he's still there. I think he spent the night last night. Isn't that what you understood? And so keep Mike in your prayers. Judy Cockrell, still on blood thinner, shots for blood clots. Doug Mansfield's sister, Carolyn Conley, is having heart problems. Hilda Donathan, Jerry Wilson's sister, is still in the hospital in Pikeville. I'm just trying to skip over all these that you can read yourself and just kind of give you the update. Charles Moore, Doug Moore, some call him Doug, some Charles, Danielle and Josh's father, has been admitted to ICU in Clark County with a severe urinary tract infection, kidney infection, renal failure, and pneumonia. And Charles is already not able to function very well as a result of a motorcycle accident. Of course, he's not able to walk and doesn't talk really well and all those things. So keep him in your prayers. John Moore is not doing well, and Edna is sick as well. How's Emily doing? Scheduled for a C-section the 8th of August. We are holding our breath until hopefully Emily will have a good, healthy baby. Tommy Oakley is not here, wearing a heart monitor, and will follow up with his heart doctor the 26th. Natalie Sparks, that's Martha Moore's daughter, her surgery went well, and it may not be as serious as they first thought. They're awaiting the pathology report tomorrow, but they actually don't think it was cancer. And Julie Webb has a torn meniscus, and her son, Braxton Young, was in the hospital in a diabetic coma, but he is awake and at home now. So lots of folks have lots of problems, and we need to continue to keep them in our prayers. Jeff, would you lead us into prayer to start the class, please?
Heavenly
Amen. Probably the most well-known of, I tried to find a poll a statistic that showed where this fits in all the best-known stories of the Bible. Of course, Noah's Ark and a whole bunch of those. The best I can come up with is this is about the third most popular account of all Bible stories. And I don't even know how they determined that. But you do hear it a lot. Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel is in his 80s by now. He's not the young teenager that he was when he first went into Babylonian captivity. He would have been about 15 then, but he has already lived through several rulers, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and Belshazzar, you remember. At the end of chapter 5, Darius the Mede became the king. That was once Babylon, Chaldea, and now it's the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. So, what happens to prisoners of war when a new regime takes over? Well, a number of things. They can be sent home. They can be just kind of blend into the new culture and continue acclimated to the new culture and continue to live there. They can continue to be prisoners. They can continue to be under the command of the new regime, which seems to be Daniel was in the stable of wise men of the king, and he continued to be such. Belshazzar, you remember in last week's lesson, seemed not to know Daniel very well. He was of the old guard, and this was a younger king, and he didn't call on him until his wife or the queen mother reminded him, there's a wise man who can interpret this handwriting on the wall. And so he called on Daniel. Daniel interpreted it for him. That very night, he lost his kingdom and his life. And then Daniel was made third ruler in the kingdom, but the kingdom lasted like a few hours after he was made third ruler. So you wonder where he is now when Darius the Mede comes in. And we start in chapter 6, and he kind of tells us a little bit about that. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. Delegation is a wise thing. You remember that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, told that way back when the children of Israel first left the land of Egypt, Moses was wearing himself out trying to judge every single thing and micromanage. And his father-in-law said, the thing you do is not a good thing. You need to set some over 1,000, some over 100, some over 10, and so on. And you handle the big stuff. Have them bring it to you when nobody else can settle it. And that way you can operate. Well, every king seems to know that. And many of the rulers seem to be aware of that. And so Darius set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. Then over those he set 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one. And that the satraps might give an account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. That means that they were people he trusted, and his holdings in the kingdom would be protected, and he wouldn't have to worry about it. You get a good manager, and you turn it over to someone who knows what they're doing. All you business people know that. You delegate to trustworthy people, and you don't have to worry about your assets. You don't have to worry about your things. You have a good person to handle it. And so Daniel was one of 3 over the satraps, but he distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, verse 3 says, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Now, you know about professional jealousy, right? You have heard of such a thing. Here is a fellow who is one of the prisoners of war. Here's a fellow who has been, he's not a local boy. He's not a Chaldean. He wasn't born and raised here. The Medes, they're all foreigners to them anyway, but the Medes and Persians are there now, and he's not one of them. He's an outsider, and yet he is so trustworthy, and God blesses him so that the king is thinking about even putting him in charge over the 3 governors who are over the 120 satraps. And so what's that going to cause? What's going to happen there? What if you were one of those other 2 guys, those other 2 governors? What'd you pick him for? I look better than he does. I'm smarter than he is. I'm one of you. I'm a local boy.
This same time you'd say, I paid my dues.
I paid my dues, yeah. I've been here the whole time. Well, Daniel been there a long time, 70 years, and so he had gotten in some seniority himself. So the jealousy the extent of this jealousy, this must have been a big deal to be considered by the king to just be over the whole thing, and the king wouldn't have to worry about it. And because the extent of this jealousy, they're going to kill him. It's going to cost him his life unless somebody intervenes, unless something happens. And so he's successful. I probably ought to keep up with this thing too. So they set a trap for him. He is very successful in what he does, and he's being considered setting them over the whole realm, and that causes envy. In verse 4, the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Does that remind you of that thing in the New Testament that talks about Christians being above reproach? That he was above reproach. They couldn't find... Above reproach doesn't mean sinless. It doesn't mean without mistakes. It means that nobody can make a charge stick for you being dishonest or any of those things. You haven't done anything that would cause them to charge you, and they couldn't find anything on Daniel to. He was above reproach, and they sought to find a charge against him, but they couldn't, and so then they said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. What is his reputation? What's his reputation in this place? He's proven. He always does what God wants him to do. He does everything correct, Donnie said. He always does what God wants him to do. Boy, what a philosophy. There was an old classic novel called In His Steps. It was written, the stage is set in the 1800s when this whole town decided that they were just going to do what Jesus would do no matter what. And man, it's amazing. It's a classic. I know you've probably read it, but if you haven't, pick it up someplace or find it online, called In His Steps. And it just explores the thought of what would happen if we just did everything that God wanted us to do and with no fear about what man would have us do. No fear about what man would do to us. And Daniel has that reputation, and I will tell you something. Christianity in America, there are a lot of Christians in America. There are not many Jews in this place except the ones who were prisoners of war, and so this is not a common thing. Daniel is unusual in standing for this God, and he's made a lot of good, he has spread a lot of good influence, hadn't he? Great influence, because Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most wicked rulers ever, finally acknowledged, after he crawled around on the ground and ate grass for a while, he finally acknowledged that God is the one. God is an absolute authority. And Belshazzar realized that on the last night of his life. He waited too late, probably. But so we have Darius the Mede, who is here, and he notices this special thing in Daniel. Daniel is envied, and they try to find something against him, and they say, we're not going to find anything against him in the way he operates in the government or the way he lives his life or any of those things. So what we're going to have to do is find something wrong with his religion. We're going to have to get his religion in opposition to the king. That's where we're going to have to... Now, they were pretty smart, weren't they? They were shrewd, devious, but you think... We were talking out in the foyer a while ago about the parable that Jesus told about the shrewd, the dishonest steward, and Jesus didn't condone or commend his dishonesty, but he did commend the fact that he would come up with a plan. He was shrewd and applied himself more so than Christians do sometimes. And so these fellows applied themselves, and they thought, how can we get him? Where can we? Well, I'll tell you one thing. If his religion is ever in opposition to the king, he's going to stand with his God, and so maybe that's how we can get him. If you're going to do that, that was a pretty good plan. In verse 6, so these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and make a firm decree. Well, they all hadn't, had they? Daniel didn't. And as far as we know, if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are still alive at this late stage, we know they would not have gone along with it. But a lot of times in church, I'm going to take a little side trip. A lot of times in the church, over the years, I've been in the church since 1966, and with a little delay for a few years and then back for a long time. But a lot of times in the church, people will come to the preacher or the elders and say, everybody says, you know, I've had them come, yeah, preacher's wife. I've had them come and say, you know, a whole lot of folks are sick of the way you're preaching and think we need a change. And I said, who are they? Well, it's a bunch of them. No, give me their names. I want to go talk to them. They're my brothers and sisters in Christ. I want to know what I'm doing wrong. Well, it's a significant number. And it always turns out it's just them. It's them or them and their wives. And so these guys come before the, and it almost always ends up that way. Well, a lot of people are saying, who are those lot of people? I want to know who they are. They're my friends and brothers. I want to go talk to them, see what I've done to them. One time I did. I called every single person in the congregation. A long time ago, I did. This guy came and he said, a lot of folks are unhappy with this. And I said, okay, I'm going to talk to them. Well, it's a lot of folks. So I sat down and got the church directory on Sunday afternoon and called every single one of them, and he was the only one that even knew what he was talking about. None of the rest of them said, well, I don't know what he's talking about. I never told him that. And so, anyway, that's the side trip. These guys come before, and it says, they told the king, we're all in this together, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, verse 7, the satraps, the counselors, advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish this decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. You will see that over and over again in the history of the Mede and Persian Empire. They had a rule where they would enact a law, and if the king signed it, it was not you couldn't undo it. It was on the books, apparently on the books forever, which is not a good idea because things change and laws have to be changed and those kinds of things. But that was what the Medes were known for. If you ever get it past the king, man, it's law. And so but there's going to be an exception here in this case. But they thought, man, we can get it by the king. And what did they appeal as far as the king is concerned? Vanity, ego, pride, all those ugly words. They come before the king and they say, we want you to sign a law that for 30 days, anybody that prays to anybody but you, I wonder why they chose 30 days. Anybody but you will be thrown into the den of lions.
30 days to catch Daniel. He done it 3 times a day. So they had 30 days to frame the charge.
They did. And they didn't have to wait long either. As soon as he found out about it.
It was a conspiracy.
Yeah, it was a conspiracy. It was definitely a conspiracy. And so they come before him and they say, you can see this king saying, well, what in the world would be wrong with the whole kingdom worshiping me? I kind of like that, he would think. And so, yeah, I'll go along with that. I'll do that. Didn't even think about Daniel not doing it, did he? But they had. And so Verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the written decree. And so they set the trap for him. Then in verse 10 and following, they actually catch him and put it into play. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before God. Now, did he do it just to defy the law? No, look at the very last phrase. As was his custom since the early days. He didn't change a thing. He just didn't change. The law changed, but he didn't change. You remember when Peter and John were arrested and they were brought before the Sanhedrin Council in Acts chapter 4, all the way through the book of Acts, but especially I think it's chapter 5 and verse 29 where they were arrested, and the way the Sanhedrin Council worked, there were 70 of them, and they were in a circular amphitheater type thing, and the accused would be down in the middle, down below them. That's an intimidating position anyway, isn't it? They're sitting up here and looking down at him, and you can just see them pointing their fingers down at old Peter and saying, "We told you not to speak anymore in his name." Peter said 2 important things, didn't he? He said, we ought to obey God rather than men, and we cannot but speak the things we've seen and heard. We can't not say these things. That's grammatically challenging, I know, but we have to say what we've seen and heard, no matter what you do to us. And so Daniel's going to pray 3 times a day, as was his custom since the early days, no matter what happens. It's not going to change him. I kind of envy his faith, don't you? I would like to think that my faith is somewhere even close to that, even near that. I would love to strive for a faith that would be even close to that. So he didn't change anything. The law changed. He just kept going. There will be laws in America eventually. If they aren't, there are already some that clash with Christianity and clash with God's law. There will be in any culture that is run by sinful people. And so you and I have to take the position we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and cause trouble and all of that, defy the laws and all those things. Just keep living your Christian life. Just keep doing the way you always knew you were supposed to do. And so Daniel knew when he knew the writing was signed. Now, do you think he knew the punishment associated with the writing that was signed? Yeah, it was public knowledge. You pray to anybody except King Darius for 30 days, and you get thrown into you'll be thrown into the lion's den. Didn't even slow him down. And he didn't do it in private. He went to his upper room and opened his windows toward Jerusalem and knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as was his custom in the early days. Then they've caught him. They spring the trap on him. These men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God, and they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Well, they knew he had. That's just the way they approached him. I do my wife that way sometimes. I'll say something that she knows, and it drives my kids nuts telling them things they already know. And so they approach him and they say, didn't you sign it? Don't we remember somewhere in the back of our... Oh, you know he signed it. You carried it in there to him. You were the ones that wrote it. And so they come before him and say, didn't you sign that? And the king said, the thing is true. Verse 12, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed, which does not alter. And so they answered and said before the king, that Daniel... You know that Daniel? I love the way this translation puts it. That Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah. Boy, they're just getting him every way they can get. You know that Daniel that's not one of us? That Daniel that you brought in here? He does not show due regard for you. That wasn't true. He showed all regard for the king. He was a faithful servant. He was an honest and good steward and governor. O king, or he doesn't show regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now, I wonder if the king, you think, some king, Belshazzar, for example, would have been upset with Daniel. This king's not mad at Daniel, is he? Look at it. Verse 14. The king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He's trying to undo this undoable law. Is there a lesson in there of the consequences of actions that we don't think through, maybe? He didn't think that through. He let his pride sign that paper, didn't he? He let his vanity, somebody said, put that signature on that paper. Well, yeah, I want them to worship me for 30 days. Nobody mentioned, you'll have to kill Daniel if you do this. Now that he finds out, he works hard. He applies himself. He labors till the going down of the sun, trying to figure out a way to undo this thing.
I thought it was interesting where he deprived himself of something to eat, and we have at this day and time his television show.
Yeah. Yeah.
He did not think of the long application of what he had signed it.
I know.
He regretted it.
Yeah.
But the decree stood. It couldn't be off.
It was done. It was done. And so you have to rely on something else. You ever done something that you couldn't undo? Yeah. That after you did it, you thought, man, how can I fix this? How can I take this back? Sometimes the only way is the blood of Jesus and forgiveness of God and throwing yourself on the mercy of the offended. And sometimes that still doesn't fix it. And it's not going to fix this. God's the only one who's going to be able to fix this. You know that passage in Romans, I know you know it, that says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of the Lord. You know, when we do that, when we separate ourselves from God because of sin, we do something that we can't undo. Isn't that amazing? But we do it nonchalantly sometimes and just wander through this life doing it all day, every day. And each one of those sinful actions is something I can't fix. Only the blood of Jesus can do that. That's what makes it so important. That we're in Jesus, that we're walking in the light and being continually cleansed by the blood. That's what makes that so important, because you can't undo sin on your own. You can't fix it. Now, you can fix some consequences. You steal money, you can take it back. You hurt someone, you can go and apologize. There are some things that the consequences you can repair. You tear up somebody's property, you can go back and fix it. I remember a friend of mine ran through a man's fence and let his cattle out one time, and he backed out, got his car back out and went home and just left a hole in the fence. And his dad made him go back and get the cattle up and run them back through and patch the fence. The mistake was made, but you can fix some of it. But this is something that he's not going to be able to repair. Darius, he's already signed this into law, and he works on this in verse 14 till the going down of the sun. But these men approached the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians. No decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed." They keep holding his feet to the fire. They keep holding. You signed it. Nobody made you sign it. You signed it. And it can't be changed, although you wanted to. And he worked on it right up till the very end, the very end of the thing, of the time. You can't fix it. And so, verse 16, the king gave the command to throw Daniel. They brought Daniel, verse 16, and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you serve continually, He will deliver you. Well, he's starting to see, and he's beginning to see. I can't fix this, so there must be a higher power to fix it. The only thing that can fix it is God. Been there? You ever been there? Oh boy. Your preacher has plenty of times. I can't fix it. But God can. And it'll be interesting and exciting and an adventure to see how He fixes it. That's the way I approach a lot of those things that I mess up royally and I can't fix them, and I'll pray to God for forgiveness, and I'll fix as much of the consequences as I can, and then I'll sit back and say, God, it's going to be interesting to see how you get me out of this. It's going to be interesting to see how you fix this. And it has. It's been an adventure over the years. And not that you purposely keep doing things over and over again, but you do. And God continues. 1 John 1 and verse 7, the blood of Jesus continues to cleanse you of all your sins. And so he, probably the most famous part of all this, the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, He will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now, what's that all about? Well, they would roll the stone over, they would put wax on it, the king would sink his ring into it, and that would be his seal, his signet, and that couldn't be broken until the king gave the word. And not only did he, but all these lords did their own signets. And so this thing's got wax all over it, and it's got all these signets in it, and these seals, and the seal's not to be broken. Why? What purpose does that serve? Nobody can rescue him. Nobody can open it and snatch him out of there when nobody's looking, because they're going to notice the seal broken. He's in there, and he's going to be in there all night, no matter what happens. I looked a little bit I did a little research about den of lions, and they would find a cave or a den or a place where lions frequented, and they would cage up the entrance and use them for punishment, use them for the death penalty, and various things. It could be a good threat, too. It could be a way for a kingdom to say, you know about the lion's den, right? You keep this law or you're going to be thrown in there. So he is thrown into the lion's den, and it's sealed up. But the story doesn't end there. God spoils this trap, doesn't He? Darius is worried. Verse 18, the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also, his sleep went from him. It happens. It happens when you don't feel like listening to music. It happens when you don't feel like sleeping because you have something heavy on your heart. Does it interest you that this pagan king, this ruthless ruler, cares this much about Daniel? Isn't that interesting? That Daniel has endeared himself to this fellow because of his character, Daniel's character and all that, and he realizes this is his fault. Sometimes we can fix a lot of problems by just saying, it's my fault. It's my fault. Why is Daniel in the lion's den? Because I signed a decree that I shouldn't have, that's why. And because of jealousy of the others. And so he's worried. He can't sleep. He spent the night fasting. He didn't eat. He didn't feel like eating. He didn't feel like having musicians brought in. They didn't have radios and iPads and all those things, so they hired the actual musicians would come in and play for the king. That was his entertainment, and he didn't feel like that. Also, his sleep went from him. How many nights have you lain awake thinking about a particular problem all night? And when you woke up in the morning, it was still there. It's still there. How many times? I couldn't tell you how many. I will tell you this has been my experience, and I'm sure it's been yours as well. Problems look a lot worse at night. I don't know why that is. But when you're lying there in bed by yourself and going over and over and over and over this problem in your head and can't sleep, and you wake up in the morning, the problem may still be there and it may still be serious, but it won't be near what it was in your mind during the night. I don't know why that is. Have you experienced that? Is that something you notice? Yeah, me too. You wake up in the morning and you think, man. Or sometimes you wake up in the morning and things been fixed and you lay awake all night worrying about nothing. That's why Jesus talked about do not worry. Paul said, don't be overcome with anxiety. And yet Darius was. He couldn't sleep. So he arose early in the morning, verse 19, and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice, grieving voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to deliver you from the lions? I wonder if he knew what he was going to hear. It says he was grieving. It was a voice of lament. He's crying, oh, Daniel, I hope you're in there. I hope you're okay. Did you make it, Daniel? Verse 21, Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. I bet that was a moment, wasn't it? That was one of those, whew, man, he's still in there. He's still talking. I don't know what kind of shape he's in, but his voice still works. He's still able to talk. And he says, O king, live forever. That's what they always had to say to the king to keep him from beheading them. And so, verse 22, he continues to teach the king a lesson. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. I was thrown in here unjustly. He had to get that in there, didn't he? Verse 23, now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. Sounds simple, doesn't it? What was the solution to this problem? Trust in your God. Trust in your God. Believe in your God. What's the solution to probably 99.9% of your problems? My problems. Trust your God. Trust in your God. He knows who you are. Can't believe I didn't think to turn that down. Sorry. I always think to do it, but not today. Trust in your God. He'll deliver you. Does he still do that? Yes. I'll never leave you. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. I'll never leave you or forsake you, so that you can boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? New Testament. For us. I will never leave you or forsake you. I love you enough to give my son for you, God said. I love you that much. You obey me, you do what Daniel did, and remain faithful to me, and I'll take care of you. And so he's delivered. And the king is exceedingly glad. The king didn't want him to be killed anyway. Those other folks, those jealous folks did. And guess what happens to them? Verse 24. The king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. And this is controversial among some folks. We'll explain a little bit why it happened. Them, their children, their wives, and the lions, their children and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Wow. That's tragic and bloody and violent, isn't it? So there's a lot of controversy, and I get questions all the time about why in situations like this did he kill the whole family? That's the way it was done back then. There could be some reasons. The parents who brought this decree before the king and who had tried to get Daniel unjustly killed, Genesis chapter 9 says that if you kill somebody, you pay for it with your own blood. And so the parents are going to be gone. What happens to the children? Maybe rather than being punished, those children were delivered. Maybe they were delivered. Because what happens to children when they die? They go to God, don't they? They go to God. And so it could be that their whole family is going to be gone, and so this was the merciful thing to do. It could be some other reasons, but God chose to take care of to get rid of the entire family of conspirators, and they were executed. There are times when the Israelites were commanded to go in and to take over a land or a city and kill everybody in it. There could be all kind of reasons for that. And again, maybe it's the merciful thing to do because their way of life is going to be gone. But it was never just for spite, was it? It was always because they've done this horrible, wicked thing. There's wickedness in the land. You remember the land of Canaan when the Jews were to take that over. Before they went to Egypt, Abraham was told, I'm going to give you this land, but the wickedness of the Amorites or the Canaanites is not full yet. They're not wicked enough for me to destroy them yet. And if they turned, then they would not have been destroyed. But they didn't turn, and 430 years later, they were wicked enough. And their land was allowed to be overrun. And so they were executed. And God is exalted. King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. He sent this out all over the place, apparently, not just his kingdom. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed. That was interesting, isn't it? He had destroyed the kingdom of the Chaldeans and taken it over, but he knows that this kingdom is not going to be destroyed. His dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues and works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. That was his decree. He sent it out to the whole all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. That's a pretty broad audience, isn't it? To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, don't mess with Daniel's God. He is the God. And so the decree went out for that. And then Daniel, of course, continues to prosper. Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, who came in after Darius. And so how many kingdoms? Well, he started out with Nebuchadnezzar, then his son Belshazzar, and then Darius and Cyrus. At least 4 kings Daniel found favor with and rose to the top of the kingdom as far as a governor could do. Second or third under the king. 4 different regimes. What's that say about God? He's everlasting. He never forgot Daniel. Does that remind you of Joseph a little bit? I always think about Joseph in this. Joseph, his brother sold him into slavery, which all of us with brothers have considered that a time or two. But his brother sold him into slavery. And he rose to the top of the man who bought him, Potiphar. He was over his whole, he was steward over all of his goods. Then he was unjustly thrown into prison. That doesn't mean bad things won't happen to you. He was thrown into prison and he rose to the top of that. And then he was delivered and rose second ruler in all of Egypt. God just kept bringing him to the top. God just kept doing that. And whatever your problems are now, God, you're already on the way to working through those and working your way toward the top. God will take care of that. That's one of the lessons that we learn. So Daniel was a man with an excellent spirit, without fault in his business dealings, faithful to those over him, the kings, committed to prayer for life, no matter what. These are all good things that you and I can learn. Willing to obey God rather than men, and he believed in his God. He had faith in his God. Daniel is a role model I think Daniel would be a good role model for a politician, don't you? Just do the right thing. What if I don't get elected? Well, sweep floors until you get elected the next time or whatever. Just do the right thing, always. Always do the right thing. Administrators of any kind who have people working under them, just be honest. Treat people right. Treat people good. And rely on God. Realize that the buck doesn't stop with you. You're not the chief authority. You may be in that company, but you're not the top dog in the world. God is. He's the top ruler. He's the top one in the whole world. Christians, old and young, Daniel as a role model. Daniel was an old man when all this happened. Is that the second time you've done that? First time. Okay. Tells you how much attention I pay. So, role models. We need to learn from the example of Daniel, who exemplified what it means to seek first the will of God and obey God rather than men. Always do that. It will always be best. I think we probably answered all your questions as we went through. Daniel was appointed one of 3 governors. He was, number 2, distinguished himself above others. His success led to envy by the others. His noble character is attested to even by his enemies. His enemies determined there's only one way to defeat him, and the king is approached by Daniel's enemies, and they propose a royal statute, firm decree. And the king is encouraged to establish this decree, and even after he did it, Daniel continued to pray. Number 9. Number 10, what was his punishment for disobeying the decree? Of course, the lion's den. When they rose early in the morning, they found Daniel alive and well. He was not injured at all. His accusers were thrown into the lion's den. We learn from this episode to be faithful to God, and He'll take care of you, and the king learned that same lesson. Okay, thank you. Next Sunday, it really gets interesting. We start out of the easy 6 chapters of Daniel and into the difficult ones, chapter 7 and one of Daniel's visions.